For centuries, members of royal blood were presented to their subjects as perfection, ideal people without flaws, surrounded by grandeur and power. But what happened to those members of royal families who were not perfect, those who were born with visible physical or psychological conditions? More often than not, they became a dark family secret that had to be hidden. Today, I'm going to tell you the stories of hidden royals whose lives were overshadowed not only by illness, but by rejection, and who, instead of luxurious palaces, found themselves behind the walls of asylums. So leave a like, and let's get into it. Before I tell you the stories of royal figures who went down in history as mad, we need to clarify one important point. When we talk about diagnoses of kings and queens of the past, or even of ordinary people, we almost never have complete certainty. As you understand, medicine in the past was very different from what we have today, and many conditions that we now clearly define simply weren't recognized back then. Women suffering from postpartum depression were often labeled as insane or diagnosed with hysteria. Conditions like autism or Down syndrome were usually seen only as signs of madness. And even something like epilepsy, which will be part of one of today's stories, was also considered a psychiatric illness. If a member of a royal family who had some kind of condition was not the heir, then, as a rule, their fate was sealed. They were forced into a closed life, for example in a monastery, but things became far more complicated when the king or queen themselves suddenly lost their mind. That's exactly what happened to Henry VI. I've already talked about him in my video about the wives of mad monarchs. He lost his sanity almost overnight after a devastating defeat that cost England nearly all of its influence in France. In 1453, the king fell into a state that is often described as catatonic schizophrenia, and the question of regency became so urgent that it ultimately led to the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses. What's also interesting is that Henry VI's claim to the French crown came through another mad king, Charles VI of France. At the beginning of his reign, he seemed completely normal and was even given the nickname the Beloved by his subjects. But one day, he suddenly suffered a violent episode and attacked his own knights. After that, his condition only grew worse, and eventually he began to believe that his entire body was made of glass. He demanded that no one come near him, and rods were sewn into his clothes so that he wouldn't accidentally shatter. It's not surprising that his subjects soon gave him a new name, and this time he became known as Charles the Mad. Just like that, 2 cases of royal madness changed the course of European history almost entirely. By the way, Charles was not the only royal to suffer from what's known as the glass delusion, a very unusual psychological condition that is almost never seen today, but was surprisingly common up until the 17th century, largely due to the growing popularity of glass as a material in Europe. Another royal who experienced this was Princess Alexandra Amalie of Bavaria. She believed that she had swallowed a glass piano, and was convinced that if she fell or made the slightest wrong movement, it would shatter inside her. She refused to wear any colour except white, and was obsessively fixated on cleanliness. Her parents tried everything to ease her condition. For example, they made her go to bed by 11 p.m. so she would stop endlessly trying to put herself in order. And once, when she became ill, they even staged a trick by throwing out a small piano figurine to convince her that it had somehow come out. And so, the princess ended up in an asylum where she spent 3 years, but unfortunately it did nothing to help her. She continued to believe that there was a piano inside her. At one point, when the brother of Napoleon I considered proposing to her, her father quite literally talked him out of marrying his own daughter. And yet, despite everything, Amalie managed to live a full and intellectually rich life, becoming the author of literary works. But not all women in history who were labelled as mad received any kind of understanding or support from their own families. Take Joanna of Castile, for example, known in history as Joanna the Mad. In her case, madness became a weapon used against her. When she inherited the Kingdom of Castile from her mother in 1504, both her father and her husband declared her insane in order to rule in her place. And Juana, as a woman who was almost constantly pregnant, was indeed very emotional and prone to dramatic outbursts toward her husband. But the rumours of her madness truly spiralled out of control after his death, when she spent several months accompanying his body on its journey to Granada for burial. The procession quickly became surrounded by countless rumours and myths. That she opened the coffin and kissed her husband, that she refused to let any women come near his body. And in the end, it was not difficult for her own father to take all power away from this young woman and confine her for nearly 50 years. And yet, many accounts from her contemporaries, people who had no direct interest in the crown, describe her as completely sane. I actually have a full video about her on the channel, so make sure to watch it if you want to understand her story better. And if you truly want to understand whether she was actually mad or just a victim of political games within her own family. Perhaps one of the most well-known stories of royal madness, now once again popularised by Netflix, is the story of George III. But for me, this is not only a love story that ended in tragedy, it is also a striking example of how harsh and misguided medicine could be at the time. Even in his youth, the king experienced episodes of mental disturbance. He himself noticed insomnia and a decline in cognitive abilities, but these episodes were usually temporary, and he quickly returned to normal social life. In the end, none of this prevented him from building a life with Queen Charlotte and having 15 children together. The real crisis came in 1788. It was preceded by a series of difficult events. The deaths of 2 of his children, the loss of the American Revolutionary War, and an overall tense political situation. The king began to suffer from hallucinations. His speech and writing turned into incoherent rambling, and he started making inappropriate advances toward women, even attempting several assaults. As you can imagine, treatment was almost non-existent. The king's doctors attempted to cure him by restraining him or applying harsh chemical compresses, believing they could draw out the so-called bad fluids. When George became violent, shouting and attacking those around him, servants would gag him and put him in a straitjacket. He would be left like that, struggling and making inarticulate sounds, until he eventually exhausted himself and calmed down. When the king behaved well, he was rewarded by being allowed to see members of his family. When he behaved badly, he was restrained again. Even meals became part of this system of reward and punishment. When he was unwell, he was fed mashed food with a wooden spoon, and when he improved, he was allowed to use proper cutlery. There were brief periods when he seemed to recover, but the episodes kept returning again and again. The final blow came in 1810, and it left him permanently in a state of madness. So much so that he did not even recognise the death of his wife, Queen Charlotte. And if he was told, he no longer understood who she was and did not warn her. By that time, he had also gone blind and deaf. And who knows? If the methods of treatment had been different, if people had known then what we know now about bipolar disorder, perhaps everything could have turned out very differently for George. But if you're thinking that all of this belongs to the distant past, a time when royals were treated with questionable methods and everything was very different, I have to disappoint you. Similar stories were still happening in the 20th century, when members of royal families were also victims of misunderstanding, poor medical knowledge, and were forced to live in isolation. A striking example of this is the forgotten son of Mary of Teck and George V, Prince John of the United Kingdom. The entire country only learned that this boy suffered from epilepsy after his death at the age of 13. Before that, for many years, everything related to his life had been kept a secret by his family. Now, you might ask, if we're talking about mental illness, what does epilepsy have to do with it? The thing is, at that time, epilepsy was often considered a form of psychiatric disorder, and it was believed that people who suffered from it should be isolated from society. They were frequently placed in epileptic colonies or asylums. The same happened to John. He was an absolutely charming and beautiful child who grew up alongside his siblings at Sandringham. But at the age of 4, he had his first epileptic seizure. As the years passed, the attacks became more frequent and more severe, and he began to show signs of developmental delay. He was still capable of forming thoughts and expressing himself, but of course, there was no question of a formal education. Doctors warned his parents that he was unlikely to live to adulthood. The royal family made the decision that it would be better for John to live away from the palace, and he was sent to Wood Farm. He was not present at his parents' coronation, and over time he appeared less and less in family photographs, to the point that many people almost forgot that there was another prince in the family. Later, the press and critics would accuse the royal family of cruelty and coldness toward John, claiming that he was hidden away so that no one would see that a member of the royal family could be ill. But once again, we have to remember that perceptions of this condition were very different at the time. In reality, he was not abandoned or rejected. His brothers and sister played with him whenever they visited, and his grandmother Alexandra of Denmark even grew roses especially for him and spent time gardening with him. He spent his last Christmas with his family, and when he died on January 18th, 1919, Mary wrote to a friend, "He has thus been spared much suffering. I cannot say how grateful we feel to God for having taken him in such a peaceful way. He just slept quietly into his heavenly home. No pain, no struggle, just peace for the poor, little troubled spirit." It was only about 20 years after John's death, around the 1940s and 1950s, that society began to accept the idea that epilepsy was not some terrible condition that required isolation, and that people could live normal lives with it. Whether the story of this little prince played a role in that shift, we don't know. But it's hard not to think about how strange it is that only 100 years separate us, and yet the difference in understanding and attitudes toward this condition is so vast. Perhaps one of the greatest victims of 20th century medicine and of Sigmund Freud among royals was Princess Alice of Battenberg, the mother of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and the grandmother of King Charles III. I actually have a full video about her on the channel, but in short, the beginning of Alice's life was quite typical for a princess of that time. She was even born at Windsor Castle in the presence of her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. The only thing that overshadowed her childhood was that she was born deaf. But despite this, she managed to learn to speak both English and German. And of course, like a true princess, she married her perfect prince, Andrew of Greece and Denmark. But everything that followed in Alice's life became a series of upheavals. Greece found itself at the very centre of the Balkan conflicts, and the monarchy there was hanging by a thread. Eventually, a revolution broke out, and she and her children were forced into exile. It's very likely that all this stress she endured, combined with her deeply religious and spiritually searching nature, led her to believe that she could heal people and communicate with Christ. Doctors diagnosed her with paranoid schizophrenia, and she was sent for forced treatment. And this is where things become especially disturbing. Because in reality, she didn't just end up in a clinic. She ended up in the hands of Freud. Sigmund Freud subjected the princess to a highly controversial course of treatment, during which he repeatedly x-rayed her ovaries in an attempt to induce early menopause and suppress what he believed to be the source of her condition. Throughout all of this, Alice insisted that she was sane and repeatedly tried to leave the asylum. She only managed to do so after 2 years. Travelling incognito, likely afraid of being confined again, she wandered across Europe and had no contact with her family for several years. I don't know whether Princess Alice was truly mad, but everything she did later in life, especially during World War II when she sheltered Greek Jews and even founded a religious order, doesn't quite match the image of a completely insane woman. But among all the stories of hidden members of royal families, one stands out in particular: the story of the Queen's cousins, Nerissa Bowes-Lyon and Katherine Bowes-Lyon. Many people learned about them through the series The Crown, where it is suggested that Princess Margaret discovers their existence through her therapist. But in reality, things were quite different. The story only became known to the wider public because a journalist, while walking through a cemetery, noticed a very familiar royal surname Bowes-Lyon, the family of the Queen Mother. And if he hadn't decided to look deeper into who was buried beneath those simple graves, the world might never have known the names of these women. They were the daughters of the Queen Mother's older brother, John, and his wife, Fenella. Interestingly, Fenella's sister also had 3 daughters with very similar conditions, born around the same time, which suggests that this may have been a genetic issue coming from that side of the family rather than the Bowes-Lyon line. To be fair, we know very little about their actual diagnoses, since they were made based on the limited medical knowledge of the early 20th century. But according to available information, the girls barely spoke and had a mental age of no more than 3 to 5 years. It is said that they had little awareness of their surroundings and did not fully understand where they were. But if you think they were placed in an institution from early childhood, that's not entirely true. For many years, their mother cared for them at home with the help of nannies. However, after she became widowed and the Second World War began, it likely became too much for her to manage. So, in June 1941, Nerissa and Katherine, along with 3 daughters of Fenella's sister, Idenea, Etheldreda and Rosemary Fane, were placed in the Royal Earlswood Hospital. The sisters received almost no financial support from the family, apart from a small annual payment for their care, and their mother continued to visit them occasionally until her death in 1966. Notably, just 3 years earlier, reference books such as Debrett's and Burke's Peerage had mistakenly listed her daughters as deceased. According to hospital staff, after their mother died, no one from the family ever visited them again, and they received no gifts or signs of attention. In 1982, volunteers from the hospital wrote to the Queen Mother, informing her that her nieces were still alive. She responded with a cheque to buy them toys and sweets, along with a note suggesting that additional funds might be provided in the future. However, when Nerissa died in 1986 at the age of 67, no money was allocated for her funeral, and she was buried in a pauper's grave, marked only with a numbered tag, the very one that the journalist had discovered. At the time the story came to light and shocked Britain, 3 of the women were still alive: Katherine Bowes-Lyon, Idenea, and Etheldreda Fane. Naturally, this raises the question, what happened next? The answer, unfortunately, is nothing. The Queen Mother faced heavy criticism, as she was a patron of several organisations related to mental health, while her own nieces had been almost completely forgotten. Katherine was moved between institutions several times and eventually died in a care home in 2014 at the age of 87. She was buried next to her sister under a very modest cross. Her death went unnoticed by the royal family. Unfortunately, these stories are yet another reminder of how people with health conditions were treated not so long ago, and how much indifference there often was. I don't want to place all the blame solely on the royal family. The Queen Mother had many relatives, and she could not personally oversee the lives of all her nieces and nephews. But perhaps someone among her staff could have done more. And in the end, this is not just a question for one person, but for the entire Bowes-Lyon family, which included not only Elizabeth, but many of her brothers and sisters. And what do you think? Who should be held responsible for the fate of these 2 forgotten sisters? For centuries, people believed that royalty was somehow different, that their blue blood made them special. But today, we understand that, in the end, we are all the same. And just like anyone else, kings and queens could suffer, both physically and mentally. What people didn't understand back then is something we are only now beginning to accept, that a person with a mental condition can still live a full life, can still be part of society, and does not deserve to be hidden away behind closed doors. It is not shame, it is simply illness. If you know other stories of royals who were labelled as mad or who truly struggled with these conditions, share them in the comments. And tell me, which of these stories affected you the most? See you in the next video.